Welcome, my name is Alan and we are back with more Massacre of El Mozote. Yes, this episode is in late, but I can't help that. I can, but yeah. Anyway. We will be jumping into Chapter 6 today, the first reports. As the side of the soldiers ebbed from northern Morazan, the guerrillas flowed back in. We knew there would be killing, but we never expected what we found, said Lico, who was with one of the first units to return. It was desolation. Total desolation. Not a person alive. Not an animal alive. Not a house that hadn't been burned. But there were bodies in the houses. Bodies in the fields. Bodies in the wells. The guerrillas immediately sent reports of the killing to their commanders. But there was a problem. The Commandancia didn't believe us. They didn't believe the numbers. Lico said, we began to count. We sent units all over looking for bodies. A lot of them were not in the houses. Many were lying out in the grass, in the fields, in the woods. We sent 3 reports up to the Commandancia. And finally, they sent other people down to the zone because they still couldn't believe the numbers. Survivors were straggling back from the caves and mountain gullies to find the plazas of their ruined villages so thick with vultures that, in the words of one man I talked with, they seemed covered by a moving black carpet. People wept, mourned, and when they could, buried their dead. Pedro Chicas, who had hidden in the cave above La Joya, returned to the hamlet to find everything burned, everything dead, corpses everywhere in the street, he said. Everything was dead. Cows, horses, chickens, pigs. We couldn't do anything with the badly charred people, but the others we buried. As the survivors returned to the hamlets around El Mozote, people from the zone were making contact with representatives of Socorro Juridiccio, which was then the human rights organization of the Archbishopric of San Salvador. Roberto Cuellar of Socorro Judico official at the time remembers hearing from members of the church groups and most people there, neighbors. Within days, it is unclear how many days, limited and sometimes conflicting memories make this sequence particularly difficult to reconstruct. Cuellar telephoned the Reverend William L. Whitfler, who was the director of Human Rights Office at the National Council of Churches in New York. Cuellar said the Atlacatl Brigade had committed a massacre in a town called El Mozote and another called La Joya, and that he brought there, he thought there might be hundreds killed and nothing had been cleaned up yet. Whipfler says Socorro had an eyewitness account. It had got two people into El Mozote. Whipfler immediately sent a telegram to Ambassador Dean Hinton asking confirmation or otherwise of reliable reports received here that indicate that between December the 10th and 13th, joint military and security forces operation took place in Morazan. Department, which resulted in over 900 civilian deaths. He also telephoned officials at the Amnesty International and other leading human rights agencies in New York and Washington and left a message for Raymond Bonner at the New York Times Bureau in Mexico City. As Whipfler remembers it, Cuellar's call came no later than December the 20th, and probably earlier. The telegram to Hinton, sent under the name of the Reverend Eugene Stockwell, Whipfler's boss, had been dated December the 15th, only 4 days after the massacre. But there is a possibility that it was actually sent later. On December 17th, an exhausted Santiago staggered into a guerrilla camp in Huacuaran, a town 50 miles south of La Guacamaya, along with other Vinqueramos people. And there, he says, he found waiting for him a radio message from Morazan. The Atlacatl Battalion massacred 1,000 peasants in various hamlets and villages. If Santiago's memory of the date is accurate, then this number arrived at less than a week after the killing. Could only have been a very rough estimate. Soldiers still occupied La Guacamaya and the area of El Mozote, and the guerrillas could have made no precise count. But after days of counting in some of the stinking hamlets, and the compilation with the help of survivors of partial list of names, the commandantes had finally been forced to believe that many hundreds had died, and they had apparently settled on the round number of 1,000. And now they wanted Santiago and the others back with a new transmitter that had been awaiting them in Huacuaran, so they could begin to make the world believe as well. After 5 days of all-night marches, the small Vinqueramos crew trudged into the ravine at El Zapatal, and it was noon on December the 24th. On Christmas Eve, according to his memoirs, Santiago was able to take to the airwaves and tell the world that Radio Vinqueremos had been reborn, and to announce that during its 2 weeks of silence, a great killing had taken place in northern Morazan. It was the inauguration of an ambitious propaganda campaign which gathered steam steadily through December and January and into February. The propaganda was based on truth, which is supposedly the most effective kind, but the Salvadoran government and later the American government would skillfully use the fact that it was propaganda, and particularly the fact that the number of dead seemed to increase with each broadcast, to undermine its truth. On December the 29th, the guerrillas learned the army detachment that had been left to occupy one of the hamlets in the zone, including at La Guacamaya and at the near El Mozote itself. The attack on La Guacamaya became a major bloodbath, Villalobos, the guerrilla commandante, told me. The lieutenant in charge knew he was in a helpless position, but he refused to surrender, probably because he knew what had happened at El Mozote and feared reprisals. We annihilated his position and he died in combat. We buried him in his uniform to honor him. The guerrillas took 7 prisoners in the operation, and 2 of them were made use of a few days later in what Santiago calls the information battle to denounce the genocide. Each prisoner described what he had seen at Cerro Pando, a village 3 miles south of El Mozote. I expected to see dead because we had talked to troops who had already been out, and they said they had killed many guerrillas, a sergeant said. Then we looked at the houses, and I realized it wasn't the way they said, because I saw dead children, and the mother was hugging one of the children. I think it was her youngest son. Santiago himself now visited El Mozote with his mobile unit and broadcast a description of the devastation, saying that it looks as if a cyclone had passed through, that from the ruins of the sacristy came a penetrating odor that indicated that beneath there were to be found who knows how many cadavers of people of El Mozote, and that in the shattered building he could see macabre scenes, chunks of human hair and fingers amid the rubble. Late in December, the FMLN got in touch with Raymond Bonner of the Times and informed him that his long-standing request to visit guerrilla-held territory would be approved. he would be welcome to come to El Morazan in early January. Also around that time, a guerrilla patrol stumbled upon some campesinos cowering in a ravine, and discovered among them a near hysterical woman of 38 whose legs and arms and face were covered with cuts. The peasants said they had came upon her near a river, found her crouched there nearly naked, her limbs and body smeared with blood and covered with thorns. I could hardly speak, Rufina Amaya recalls. I talked and tried and cried, talked and cried, couldn't eat, couldn't drink, just babbled and cried and talked to God. Now the guerrillas had found her, and they rejoiced when they realized who she was. They were happy that there was at least one survivor, Rafina says. They all came up around me and hugged me. I didn't know what was going on, who they were, what they wanted. She was taken to El Zapatal and interviewed, and before long the voice of Rufina Amaya, telling in careful detail the story of what had happened in El Mozote, was broadcast throughout El Salvador. On December the 31st, the General Command of the Morazan Front of the FMLN issued a call to the International Red Cross, the OAS Human Rights Commission, and the international press to verify the genocide of more than 100 Salvadorans in El Mozote and the surrounding hamlets. Of more than 900, We ask these organizations to be the eyes of the world's conscience, the Comandante said. That night, at the time that Radio Venqueramos was broadcasting a mass in memory of the 1,000 massacred, El Salvador's provincial president, José Napoleón Duarte, felt obliged to take to the airwaves and deny the accusations personally. The entire massacre story, he said, was a guerrilla trick meant to smear his government in the very moment when the United States Congress was considering aid to El Salvador. Duarte was right in at least one respect. Though the El Mozote controversy appeared to center on what had happened in a handful of hamlets in a remote region of El Salvador, the real point of focus had shifted to Washington, and in particular to Congress, which had perceived as the weak spot of the armor of the Salvadoran government. It was Congress that voted the money that paid for the American guns and helicopters and military advisors in the recent years, and the atrocities had grown ever more frequent. Congress had done so with increasing reluctance. 2 days before Duarte's speech, Reagan had signed Congress's amendment of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, which required the president to certify that the Salvadoran government is making a concerted and significant effort to comply with internationally recognized human rights and is achieving substantial control over all the elements of its own armed forces, so as to bring to an end the indiscriminate torture and murder of Salvadoran citizens by these forces. If such a certification was not delivered to Congress by January the 29th and convincingly defended, all funds and assistance for El Salvador would be immediately suspended. Now all sides prepared for the debate over certification, which would provide concerned congressmen, church leaders, heads of human rights groups, and others with a new opportunity to document the abuses committed by the Salvadoran government in prosecuting the war. Administration officials, meanwhile, both in Washington and in the embassy in San Salvador, prepared to defend the government and demonstrate that despite appearances to the contrary, which were thanks largely they would imply as blatantly biased journalists and overly credulous human rights zealots, the Salvadorans were improving in their respect of human rights. Many of these officials viewed the certification requirement with singular contempt. If Congress itself so strongly felt so strongly about human rights abuses, it could have simply cut off aid. Elliot Abrams, who had just been sworn in as Assistant Secretary of State of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, told me. But Congress didn't cut off aid because it didn't want to risk being blamed if the guerrillas won as a result for losing El Salvador. Instead, they required certification, which is to say they agreed to fund the war while reserving the right to call us fascists. Dean Hinton, the United States ambassador at the time, later told an interviewer that he viewed certification as a way for Congress to be for and against something at the same time. Congressmen, he said, didn't want to take responsibility to deny resources to the government of El Salvador, and on the other hand, they didn't want to endorse it, so they created a certification procedure and made the rest of us jump through the hoop. And the president made and the president had to certify it. The entire certification procedure, Hinton said, is a political cop-out by a lot of congressmen. At the root of this political cop-out, in the unspoken view of many administration officials, was a simple truth that when it came down to either supporting the Salvadoran government, however unseemly its methods, or allowing a victory by the guerrillas, the choice was clear, and the only difference between the people in the administration and the hypocrites in Congress was that the Reagan officials were not afraid to say it straight out. Abrams told me, I used to say to people, I can see arguing for the FMLN victory on political grounds or economic grounds, but on human rights grounds? That's crazy. Abrams stood on the human rights argument on its head, contending that to argue for an aid cutoff was, in effect, to argue for a guerrilla victory, and that in the end of the day, however badly the Salvadoran government behaved, those collective atrocities could never approach the general disaster for human rights that was the FMLN victory would represent. But we'll go ahead and end that part there. So yeah, we are now seeing the aftermath. In the U.S., people were told there might have been a massacre or two, but it's all in the job to fight communism. And that's, I can guarantee you that's how it's portrayed. Because that's how the Cold War era was often used. Oh, it's in the part of the fight against communism. Yeah. I think Abrams was that monster. Who was responsible? Is he the one I'm thinking of? There was somebody who worked for Reagan who was like highly responsible for the massacre. Yeah, I think it was Abrams. Let's see. Yeah. He was involved in the Iran-Contra scandal, which again was something else used in the war against communism. Okay. According to Wikipedia, Abrams frequently defended the human rights record of the El Salvador government, the government that committed this atrocity, and attacked human rights groups as communist sympathizers when they criticized the El Salvador government. In early '82, when reports of the El Mozote massacre of hundreds of civilians by the military in El Salvador began appearing in U.S. media, Abrams told a Senate committee that the reported number of deaths in El Mozote was not credible. See, and that's what they're saying here. They were proclaiming, it's not a believable number because it keeps changing and, it's propaganda. Reasoning that the reported number of deaths was greater than the likely population and that there were survivors. There were survivors, no problem. Fuck Abrams. He is a monster of a human being. He said that it appears to be an incident that is at least being significantly misused at very best by the guerrillas. The massacre had come at a time when the Reagan administration was attempting to bolster its human rights image of the Salvadoran military. Abrams implied that reports of a massacre were simply FMLN propaganda and denounced U.S. investigative reports of the massacre as misleading. In March of 1993, the Salvadoran Truth Commission reported that over 500 civilians were deliberately and systematically executed in El Mozote in December of 1981 by forces affiliated with the Salvadoran government. A 1992 Human Rights Watch report criticized Abrams for downplaying the massacre. Also in 1993, documentation emerged suggesting that the Reagan administration officials could have known about El Mozote and other human rights violations from the beginning. However, in July of 1993, an investigation commissioned by Clinton Secretary of State Warren Christopher into the State Department's activities and conduct with regard to human rights in El Salvador during the Reagan years, found that despite U.S. funding of the Salvadoran government that committed the massacre at El Mozote, individual U.S. personnel performed creditably and occasionally with personal bravery in advancing human rights in El Salvador. Abrams said in 2001 that Washington's policy in El Salvador was a fabulous achievement. In 2019, he said that the fabulous achievement was that El Salvador had been a democracy. In a 1998 interview, Abrams remarked, "While it was important to us to promote the cause of human rights in Central America, it was more important to prevent a communist takeover of El Salvador." Like I said, this is part of the Cold War bullshit that went on. Part of that Cold War bullshit. Yeah. Abrams was a piece of shit human being. Still is a piece of shit human being. And, he got grilled for it when he decided he wanted to be part of the Trump administration. Yeah, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, appointed Abrams as the United States Special Representative to Venezuela. Fuck you, Abrams. Fuck you, Pompeo. Piece of shit human beings both. Piece of shit human beings. And like I've said, we've read through the portion that shows the gruesome details that happened. But fuckers like this are like, oh, it's just a fight against communism. Sounds like many of these people were innocents that were slaughtered in your fucking war. Fuck you, Abrams. Fuck you. Yeah. The Cold War was a bullshit era that allowed so many excused atrocities to happen. And the advancements we had were often advancements made as a form of military protectionism. Woo! That military America! If you aren't saddened by the fact that it was American training that and American funds that set up this atrocity, this monstrosity, I have no hope for you as a human being. I really do not. I mean, honestly, but again, this was part of the propaganda routine. Gotta stop communism at every turn. So we'll teach people to slaughter their own. So they can say they were fighting communism, even though they were killing civilians. Fuck this goddamn shit. And that he goes, oh, because it was a democracy. You can be a communist democracy, you know. In fact, that is pretty common. All communism is the actual citizens owning production instead of corporations and single individuals. And thus fucking over workers. No, communism, the workers control it. Or at least that's the idea. If it goes in a different direction, it's not communism. But yeah. I grew these in my garden. I made these in my shop. I shall trade you. Da da da. This for my labor. You know, that's how communism works. Period. That's how it works. But oh, the propaganda! I hate this fucking world sometimes. Anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. That's going to be the end of this episode. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tries to tell you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. If you want, I can put this link in Wikipedia in the description box below the video about Elliot Abrams. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.